in chapters 13 and 14 of Isaiah. Isaiah chapters 13 and 14. We're going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning of class doing kind of an exercise to help us see where we are in the book of Isaiah and where we're going. That will be interactive, so it's not going to be anything too difficult, so don't worry about that. But it will be participatory. So before we do that, we're going to pray, and Grant is going to lead us in prayer. So let's bow together and ask God to be with us.
Will you bow with me in prayer? Father God, you are holy, you are mighty, you know everything, and yet you still forgive us when we fall in secret and in sight of others. Please bless the studies that are going around all across the globe right now. Please bless the speakers and the people who are serving you in silence and in the openness of the world today. Please be with the students. Please help them to understand or learn something so we can apply it to our lives. Please help us to always keep our focus on you and not be distracted during the lesson today, and going out and serving you always. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
All right, thanks, Grant. So this section of the book of Isaiah, what I want to do is, for those of you that have paper Bibles that have headings at the beginning of the chapter or beginning of sections or paragraphs, what I want to do is just walk through this next section to kind of see what Isaiah is about to start talking about and what's going to occupy the bulk of his prophetic work for the next few chapters. So this morning we're going to be looking specifically at prophecies against the nation of Babylon. Not exclusively, we'll also talk about Assyria and Philistia. Last week, you may remember that we focused on prophecies of judgment against another nation. Does anybody remember, just off the top of your head, who we talked about primarily last week that God was going to judge? Assyria. I heard somebody say it. Dale, okay. Yeah, the Assyrians. And this is kind of an odd judgment in some ways because it starts with God saying, Assyria is the rod of my discipline. They're his chosen instrument to bring judgment on nations of the world that had been opposed to God, including the northern kingdom, Israel, and to some extent the southern kingdom, Judah. But it concludes with God turning right around and saying, but because you think that this is all you're doing, and because you're not realizing that I'm actually allowing you to do this and using you to do this, you're not humbling yourselves. Because of that, I'm going to bring judgment against Assyria, and it's going to be devastating. So that's who we looked at last week. This week we're going to focus on Babylon, and that gives us an idea of where we're going. Isaiah, in this section of the book, is going to focus on a number of national judgments against a number of nations around Israel and Judah. This is something that is not uncommon in the prophets. If you look at Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos. A number of prophets talk like this, and not only do they give judgments against foreign nations, but they kind of group them all together in their writings, which may be a literary device. It may be by God's design, like he has them prophesy all these things at one time. It could be that they're just arranged together thematically because of the content. But I want you to notice how far into Isaiah this is going to go. So skip ahead to the first chapter for next week, chapter 15. And if you have a chapter heading in your Bible, who is the judgment against in chapter 15? Moab. Okay, how many chapters does that last before the judgment shifts to somebody else? 2 chapters. Good. So 15 and 16 are both against Moab. Who's next on the list? Damascus. Does anybody remember who Damascus was, or like who they represented? Okay, not Samaria, close though. And maybe that's what y'all said, and I just wasn't hearing it. Syria. So Damascus, and it's interesting because Damascus, remember, going back a few chapters, was the most prominent threat that the king of Judah was worried about. There was this alliance between Damascus and the Syrians, and Israel, Samaria, the northern kingdom. And he was kind of concerned about that, and God said, hey, I'm going to take care of that, and tried to even offer him a sign to prove it. So just to kind of show how quickly the scene is changing, these nations that were most threatening to the southern kingdom, to Judah, in a matter of decades, if that, are completely off the scene or out of the picture. So this judgment against Damascus and Syria in chapter 17, who's next? Ethiopia. Okay, this is interesting. Ethiopia doesn't really show up a whole lot in terms of prophetic judgments, but they're going to show up here in chapter 18. Who's next? Okay, Egypt, chapter 19. That continues into chapter 20 with Egypt and Ethiopia. What do you have next in terms of national headings, judgment headings? Okay, Babylon, we're coming back to Babylon in chapter 21. Anybody else that shows up in chapter 21? Okay, the Edomites and Arabia, okay? Who's next? You may have to skip a few chapters for this one, or one or two chapters. Tyre, okay, Tyre in chapter 23. And maybe some of you have other headings. I heard Jerusalem from a couple of you, so maybe there's some places in there that we'll get to with that. Tyre in chapter 23. And then look at chapter 24. What headings do you have to begin chapter 24? Judgment against the whole earth. So by the end of this section, nobody's getting out unscathed, is kind of the picture here. But you see just how big of a section of the book of Isaiah this is. And I wanted to point that out so we don't get lost in the trees and end up missing the forest. But this is God reminding his people, and really reminding the whole world, who's really in charge and who's on the throne. And then once he does that, once he's done with that, the last section of the first half of Isaiah, the first part of Isaiah, is he's going to come back to Jerusalem and Judah and basically tell the story about their fall, of Babylon coming in and taking them captive and explaining what was going to happen. So that's going to be what we're moving toward, what we're looking forward to. But we're going to spend at least 2 or 3 weeks, I think, going through these national judgments. Next week, we're going to fly. We're going to cover 6 chapters, so be ready for that. But we'll kind of get our feet wet this week just by looking at Babylon. And this will allow us to read a little bit more than we normally would. So I want to start with the first half of chapter 13. We won't read through all of chapters 13 and 14, but kind of a representative sample. I'd like to ask for a couple of volunteers to read 8 verses apiece. So if you're willing to read nice and loud, if you feel like you brought a lot of air with you this morning, then raise your hand. And who would like to read verses 1 through 8 for us? Grant, you got it? Okay, verses 9 through 16. Who would like to read those? Carrie, okay. All right, the Hafer tag team in the back has got it covered. Thank you, guys. Go right ahead.
You said 13, right?
13, 1 through 8, and then 13, 9 through 16. Yes, sir.
The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Lift up a standard on the bare hill. Raise your voice to them. Wave the hand that they may enter the doors of the nobles. I've commanded my consecrated ones. I have called my mighty warriors, my proudly exalted ones, to execute my anger. A sound of tumult on the mountains, like that of many people. A sound of the uproar of the kingdoms, of the nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. They are coming from a far country, from the furthest horizons. The Lord and his instruments of indignation to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as the destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all the hands will fall They will rise like a woman in labor. They will look at each other in astonishment, and their faces are aflame.
See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate, to destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger. Like a hunted gazelle, like sheep without a shepherd, they will all return to their own people. They will flee to their native land. Whoever is captured will be thrust through. All who are caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted and their wives violated. See, I will stir up against them the Medes who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men, and they will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children.
Okay, good. Thank you both for reading that. So, pretty clear here what's on the horizon. Judgment is coming, and it's not pretty. It's devastating. I mean, some of the descriptions in this are kind of uncomfortable just to read. So this is God telling through Isaiah, telling what he's going to do to the Babylonians. And it's kind of remarkable to read things like that because, I mean, literally 1, 2, 3 chapters ago, we were just reading about the Assyrians experiencing this same kind of judgment against them, and the Babylonians were going to be the ones inflicting it. So this is, you see the sequence of events here. What God is doing is he's pronouncing judgment on his people at the hands of the Assyrians. It's going to be a terrible judgment. And now the Babylonians are going to turn around and bring judgment on the Assyrians. But then God's not going to be done with that. He's going to bring judgment on the Babylonians at the hands of the Medes, as Carrie pointed out in verse 17. So having said that, what are some of the things that stand out to you? Anything specific, any details that you noticed in this section that you found especially important or interesting, or any questions that you want to bring up to the class as we read through this?
I was going to mention that this coordinates with Daniel, and you can almost see when that happens. Remember the
Right.
writing on the wall, and then while that banquet was being done, you see the Medes come in and attack, and so you see that.
Good. So this is one of the impressive things about the prophets is you have prophecies being made about the same historical events, but they're being made decades and centuries apart. So what Isaiah talks about here, this judgment that's coming on Babylon, Daniel lives through it, and he basically gives us like a firsthand account of it. And as Tim mentioned, that's the incident where King Belshazzar is throwing this party, and he's using like the implements from the temple in Jerusalem, and this hand shows up and writes on the wall and basically tells him that you've been weighed, you've been numbered, and you've been found wanting. And that night, his kingdom is taken from him by a guy named Darius, who's a Mede. Now, one thing, I'll just go ahead and mention this. I don't know where else to fit this in, but historically, one of the remarkable things about this is how it happened. Because if you look at the history of this, extra biblical, but like secular history, what historians have said about the fall of Babylon is it was one of the most fortified cities that's ever existed. I mean, it had multiple walls around the city. They were thick walls that were so wide you could drive chariots on them, well fortified. So well fortified that when the Medo-Persian coalition showed up to fight against the Babylonians, they weren't even worried about it, because they felt like the city was so well fortified, there was no way that the Medes could get into the city. So what they did is the river that ran into Babylon, I think it's the Euphrates River. Basically what they did is they figured out if we divert the waters of the river upstream from Babylon, then what's going to happen is we're going to have a passageway into the city through the riverbed that the water is no longer, running through because they diverted the water around into the surrounding areas. So as they're doing this, the Babylonians are inside their city partying it up because they feel like they're safe. So when the Medes and Persians get into the city, there's like no resistance because everybody's drunk from this party. So, when you get the details of Daniel, in one night, this whole city, like one of the mightiest empires that the world has ever known, falls in one night, at least the capital city does. It's remarkable to see how that plays out historically. But I think Isaiah's perspective is that God is the one who's behind this. For all of the ingenuity of the Medes and Persians in battle, that none of this would happen without the working of God. Yes, sir, Wayne.
I find it interesting how many times "I will" is in this. God says, "I will." There's no "I may" or "I might" or "who is doing it." It's God, and it will happen.
Good. So the certainty, and I think this is one of those takeaways from the prophets as well, the certainty with which God speaks concerning anything that he's going to do, blessings, judgment, we see that no matter how unlikely or improbable it might seem, it's going to come to pass exactly as God says. And the only reason it wouldn't come to pass is if somebody listened to the warning and used it as an occasion to change and to repent. And I think that's part of why God is pronouncing this. God says, he's going to say later on, Isaiah, that basically this is how you know who I am, that I'm God and there's nobody like me, is because I tell the end from the beginning. He tells things that are going to come to pass as if he knew them long ago, because he did. So you see that for a couple of reasons. One is to give people enough advance warning to potentially listen and change. But if they're not going to do that, to give other people confidence that this God really is going to do exactly what he says. Very good. Anything else that you notice in this description of judgment? Carol, yes, ma'am.
I think it's going to have to see the desperation that they're going to have, so they lose all hope. There'll be no light in the world for them.
Yes.
To, draw any comfort on. It's not going to be there.
Good. So some of these descriptions of judgment, I think, are very helpful to us, not just in the context of what God was going to do to Babylon, but in the broader context of understanding judgment language. Carol mentioned the idea of the lights, kind of like the lights being turned off. Go back to verse 9. And let's read a couple of verses here. Verse 9, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light." So whenever God wanted to picture like this total devastation or this total judgment that was coming against a nation, this is oftentimes the language you would use. It was the language about the natural light sources not shining. And I think the idea is that it's basically, I'm going to turn the lights out in this place. It's going to be so devastating, this judgment that's coming, that nothing is going to be left remaining. Now, one of the reasons I want to focus on this is because this is language, as I mentioned, that shows up elsewhere in Scripture. And there are a number of places you can go and see this, but do those pictures of like the sun being darkened and the moon not shedding its light, or some places you'll see something like the moon will be turned to blood, which is, I think, just a way of saying like it's going to be darkened, Where else do you recognize language like that from the prophets? Or actually from anywhere in the Bible?
Acts 2.
Good. So Acts 2, when Peter on the day of Pentecost is preaching and he quotes Joel 2, he uses language like that. And the whole point of that sermon was to teach people that this was the moment in history that God was pouring out his Spirit on all mankind. And what that meant was there will be blessings that will come with that, and salvation will be available for those who call on the Lord. But there will also be judgment for those who reject him. Tim?
And that would be like, this shows us it means a changing of a kingdom, a changing of power. So the kingdom of heaven came on the day of Pentecost.
Okay, good.
And so you see a change in that, and that's how the terminology is used.
Good. So like a not just lights out for one nation, but when you have something like Babylon, which was such a world power, that vacuum is going to be filled by somebody. And in this case, what we've seen in the sequence of events is whoever does the conquering of kind of like the big kid on the block or the bully, they're the ones who step into that role and are going to fill the void. But I think that's a good point, that it's not just a judgment on one nation, but it's also kind of a changing of the guard. So Acts 2 is one of the places we see that. Joel 2, any other places that come to mind you can think of? Okay, so language like this is in Revelation, which, just trying to think back about that, if this is language that's indicative of a judgment against a power or a nation, from what you know of the book of Revelation, who would that be directed toward? Whose lights were about to be turned out in Revelation? Okay, yeah, ultimately Satan, but in terms of like a world sense, a world power sense, who would you say? Rome, yeah, the Roman Empire. The book of Revelation is kind of a twofold judgment, a judgment that's going to be brought against Rome and like all of the forces that made her what she was, and then like this judgment against Satan and what he's doing and his part in that as well. So you have language like that. The reason I want to bring this up is partly so that we're not uncomfortable when we hear people talk about this. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was a kid, I don't remember how old I was, pretty young, I suppose, maybe 7 or 8. I remember being in the checkout line at Walmart, and when you're in a checkout line at a grocery store, you look over and you have all these like magazines and tabloids. And I saw one of them, and it said something like, it had a picture of a red moon on it, and it said something like, moon turns to blood, global panic. And it was basically like, get ready because judgment's going to come. And, being a 7 or 8 year old kid, I was like, pulling on my dad's shirt. I was like, Dad, did you see this? We need to go stock up on some supplies, or what are we going to do, basically? It really kind of shook me a little bit. And I think this is how we sort of work through that, because inevitably you'll hear language like that anytime somebody sees shifts in global power. You'll hear people talking about, is this the day of the Lord? Is this the coming of the Lord? Is this like the end of times? Did you notice in verse 9, what does Isaiah call this?
The day of the Lord.
The day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord biblically is not just the day in which Jesus will come back to judge for the final time. The day of the Lord, or a day of the Lord, was any time that God would show up and judge a nation or a people or a power. That phrase is used a lot of times in the prophets for this very kind of thing. So whether it was Babylon or Assyria or later on the Medes and Persians, or another place where this shows up, and actually this is what I wanted to touch on, Matthew 24, when Jesus is talking with the apostles before he goes to the cross about a judgment that's coming, he uses this language. And a lot of people will look at that and they'll say that's talking about the second coming. But in context, it makes a lot more sense that Jesus is describing the destruction of Jerusalem. The day of the Lord was what was going to happen to Jerusalem because of what the Jewish nation was about to do to Jesus. So you'll see things like that show up throughout Scripture. Descriptions of the sun being darkened or the moon being turned to blood, or a day of the Lord. Don't be afraid of that kind of language. And I think these are texts that help us understand how to process that. It's basically just God saying, I'm going to get ready to judge somebody. And that's why context is really important. Isaiah 13 makes it really clear who this is talking about. because he names the Babylonians here. So anytime you see language like that, look first in the context to see if the recipients of the judgment are identified at any point in the writing. Tim?
This passage is great to understand that God's judgment is coming on Babylon in parallelism to Revelation, where the evil is depicted as Babylon and the victory ultimately comes. I don't know whether or not you could put anything into verse 3 where it says, I have commanded my sanctified ones. And of course, that would be, of course, the Medes and Persians. But the picture can come over to Revelation and say, I have my sanctified ones that I'm protecting, and they're going to win the victory. So, we see victory in Revelation.
Good. And the Babylonians sort of, from this point on, become a symbol of anybody who's going to set themselves up as the great power, and in so doing, they set themselves against God. So good, very good. There's some other things in chapter 13 that I'll just touch on very briefly. The picture of devastation at the end of the chapter, it's going to be a place that's so greatly destroyed. That was a poor way to say that, sorry. But it's going to be like when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. And he talks about these descriptions of people aren't even going to go there and pitch tents. Shepherds aren't even going to take their flocks there. It's just going to be so overwhelmingly laid bare that nothing's going to be there except wild animals. And this is another one of those historical prophecies that has seen historical fulfillment. If you go back to the area that today is Babylon, or that was Babylon, nobody's there. From what I understand, it's actually an area that, and I think that this is providential, because of the way that the Euphrates River kind of meanders. It's one of those rivers that will flood at certain times of the year and overflow its banks, and then it'll change course. That basically that whole area has kind of been turned into just a big marshy, swampy mess. And nobody would go in and try to rebuild on it. Although people have tried. And that's something that you can spend a little bit of time digging into. People in history who've been mighty and have appreciated the power of the Babylonians have tried to kind of recreate that on their own. Most recently, I think Saddam Hussein was an example of that, who vocally stated that he was, intending to bring back Babylon, so to speak. And every time somebody does that, you kind of see here, this is to Wayne's point, if God says this is the way that it's going to be, then this is the way it's going to be. It's so, the evidence is so compelling that it has led some textual critics to say Isaiah had to have been written later, after the fall of Babylon. There's no way it could have been written 700 BC or whatever, because what Isaiah said is exactly what happened. And there's no way that somebody could have predicted that to that degree. Well, of course there is, if they're speaking through, if God is speaking to and through them. So, yes, Carrie.
I also think it's interesting that in verse 11, he talks about, right, this is all coming forth because of their pride and their arrogance. And that's
Yes.
actually a common theme. So back in Proverbs, he talks about there's 6 things that the Lord hates, right? And the very first one are haughty eyes, the idea of pride. So it seems like every time a nation gets to the point where they're like, we're it, we're the top
Right.
apex pinnacle, God brings them tumbling down. And that's scary.
Yes. And you want to talk about, like modern relevance of a book like Isaiah. If you're looking around at the world landscape and you're like, okay, who's next in this? Like, who does this sound like today? You can probably come up with a short list of nations that might fit these qualifications. And if we're being honest, we're probably on that list. Again, I'm not trying to say I'm like predicting anything or speaking for God. I'm just saying that Carrie's point is that this has to serve as a perpetual warning to not allow success and power to breed arrogance and pride and this idea that we are here because we got ourselves here. So we have to be very careful with that attitude. All right, let's get into chapter 14. And chapter 14 is interesting because it's, at least initially, is Israel looking back at Babylon after this happens, and kind of, it's like after the bully gets knocked out, all the kids that he picked on, they all kind of start to take their shots at him now. And Israel's going to do that, and some of the other nations that Babylon has conquered are going to be pictured as taunting Babylon from Sheol, from the grave, basically, and saying, okay, now you know how this feels. How do you like being in our shoes and experiencing what you did to us? So let's read a little bit of this section. Why don't we read 3 through 21. I said a little bit. I guess that's quite a big chunk. But let's read 3 through 21, and we'll split this up into a couple of sections as well. Would somebody read 3 through 12, and then someone read 13 through 21? To have a couple of volunteers to read for us. Anita, 3 through 12, please. And then 13 through 21. All right, Phil, you got it. The Elf Key tag team. Thank you.
And it will be in the day when the Lord gives you rest from your pain and turmoil and harsh service in which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased and how fury has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, which used to strike the peoples in fury with unceasing strokes, which subdued the nations in anger with unrestrained persecution. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into shouts of joy. Even the cypress trees rejoice over you, and the cedars of Lebanon say, since you were laid low, no tree cutter comes up against us. Sheol from beneath is excited over you to meet you when you come. It arouses for you the spirits of all the dead, all the leaders of the earth. It raises all the kings of the nations from their thrones. They will all respond and say to you, even you have been made weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp and the music of your harps have been brought down to Sheol. Maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations.
But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. Those who see you will gaze at you. They will ponder over you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a wilderness and overthrew its cities, who did not allow his prisoners to go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you have been cast out of your tomb like a rejected branch, clothed with the slain who are pierced with the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a trampled corpse. You will not be united with them in burial, because you have ruined your country. You have slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers not be mentioned forever. Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers. They must not arise and take possession of the earth and fill the face of the world with cities.
All right. Thank you both. So a lot more of the same kind of language, just really clear pictures of how devastating these judgments would be. One of the things that I think we see play out is when you have a nation like the Babylonians, and I think this would have been true of the Assyrians and a lot of empires at this stage in world history, in order to become what they were, at some point, a nation that kind of has its own natural or historical boundaries starts to grow and is using resources and stuff like that, and it kind of gets as big as it could get in the area that it gets, but it doesn't. It's not satisfied with what it has, and so it starts to kind of branch out and try to take from the nations around it. One of the things, and I think that this is one of the reasons biblically that God judges nations that do that to such a great extent. Because when you think about biblically why the nations are where they are, or why they end up where they are, Paul has a commentary on this in the city of Athens when he's preaching in Acts 17 in the city of Athens. He basically points out to them that this God that they don't know, the true God, Jehovah, is the God that made us all and has appointed our times and our dwelling places. And so it's the idea that God has a hand in where everybody ends up. And you can even see that, tracing it through the first 10 chapters of Genesis. God takes man and puts him in a garden and gives him tasks and tells him to be fruitful and multiply. But then they rebel against him, and so he drives them out. But he still gives them the same commands: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. So they do that until they become wicked to the point that God has to bring a judgment on them in Genesis 6 with the flood. And then he starts over with Noah and his family, and they fill the earth and they are fruitful and they multiply. But then they stop doing that in chapter 10 with the Tower of Babel, and so God confuses the languages so that they will scatter and do and go where he wanted them to go. The point is that you see God having a hand in everybody kind of being where they are. So when a nation takes the land that God has given them, and they either abuse it or they say, this isn't enough for us, we want more, and they start to expand and they start to take from the nations around them, you see, just how, to what a degree nations like the Babylonians did this. They were so all-consuming in their expansion that the forests of Lebanon are pictured as rejoicing, because they say, nobody's going to come and cut us down anymore. Like, we couldn't even grow because the Babylonians just kept coming in and taking everything. And so the trees in Lebanon are pictured here as rejoicing in the judgment against Babylon, because they're finally going to be able to be left alone, basically. So you see things like that in the language here. Anything else that stood out to you? I want to ask about one part of this, but anybody have any comments on what we read through? Tim, go ahead.
Do you think verses 1 and 2, kind of skipped over that, would that also be Isaiah prophesying about the Medes and the Persians being the ones that brought them back to their place? Because the Medes and the Persians are overcoming the Babylonians, but they're also the ones in God's plan that Cyrus will declare, you can go back to your land, and it kind of indicates that in those passages right there. The people will take them and bring them to their place.
Good. I think so. That makes sense to me. That you have in verses 1 and 2, as Tim pointed out, also a picture of what God was going to do for his people on the other side of the judgment, which is part of these prophetic judgments. God doesn't just talk about the nation that's going to be judged, but he also talks about how it's going to impact his people. And basically, when you have a power as great as Babylon that falls, we mentioned this vacuum, this power vacuum. It was going to shake the whole world because of how integrated Babylon was in everybody's business, and how much area they had conquered. And so the rest of the world kind of wonders, okay, well, who's going to show up and who's going to show up on the scene now? What's it going to mean for us? Well, God's telling his people, I'm going to take care of you guys. I'm going to bring you back and put you back on your land. Very good. One thing to notice, verse 12, how you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. Does anybody have a different translation of that? I'm only going to touch on this because this is a verse that gets twisted sometimes. Star of the morning is, in Latin, I believe, is the word Lucifer. And some people, if you've ever heard people talk about like the origins of the devil and Lucifer and where he comes from, that he was a fallen angel, this is one of the texts that gets the most attention, because they'll point to star of the morning, and they'll point to things like, you said in your heart, verse 13, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the recesses of the north. Kind of this puffing up of this person to a level greater than God or higher than God. And people will say, well, that sounds an awful lot like the devil or like Satan, so this must be about him. But again, rule number one, anywhere in the Bible, but especially in the prophets, is context. When God clearly identifies who he's talking with here, I think that should narrow our field of investigation. And when God just comes out and says, hey, I'm talking to the Babylonians, any sort of anything that we would do beyond that, or anything we would do to try to apply this to someone outside of that context, we should be careful about. So in context, if you hear somebody talking about Isaiah 14 or talking about like Lucifer and the origins of Satan, and they're talking about Isaiah 14, keep in mind that this is really a prophecy. It's an extension of this judgment against Babylon. Now, for the sake of time, I want to touch on a couple of other things at the end of the chapter. Does anybody have any comments on that, though? Just really quickly. Okay. So 2 more judgments. One is on Assyria in verses 24 through 27. And one is on the Philistines in verses 29 through 32. The judgment on Assyria could be one of 2 things. It could be another prediction. Of course, Isaiah's predicting this before it comes to pass. It could be him kind of doubling down on the prediction of of Assyria being judged. It could also be a way of God saying, after making such a bold claim about Babylon, like how could Isaiah stand up and say that God was going to take this nation that was this empire that was a global power and basically just devastate them? How could God do that? And Assyria was sort of the proof, like God could do it because he already did it with Assyria, and he used Babylon to do it. So if God could do that with Assyria by way of the Babylonians, he could certainly do that with the Medes and Persians, or to the Babylonians by way of the Medes and Persians. The last thing to point out, go ahead, Phil.
And just to follow up on that, and he says, I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to tell you it's going to happen, because it already has, and it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen.
Good. So basically, we learn the lesson or history repeats itself, is kind of the idea. Yeah, very good. The last judgment here in this chapter is against the Philistines. What was the deal with the Philistines? What was the reason that God was going to judge them? Anybody notice? So that was one of the things historically, definitely, is they were enemies of God's people for a long time. Very good. And that may play into this some. There's something that God mentions in the text, or that Isaiah mentions in the text, kind of about their attitude and their response to these world events. What were they, as this was unfolding, what was their attitude? This would be like verse 29. Do not rejoice, O Philistia, all of you, because the rod that struck you is broken. I mean, the Israelites weren't the only ones. The Jews weren't the only ones being threatened by Assyria and Babylon. The Philistines were getting beaten up too, and having their lunch money stolen and all that stuff. So, I mean, you can imagine the attitude when they see these nations fall. The natural response would be to rejoice. And God's point is that if you think that's bad, wait till you see who's coming down, down the runway, so to speak. You escape from or what he basically says in verse 29, that from the serpent's root a viper is going to come out and give birth to flying serpents. So you're being stung by this Babylonian serpent, where you're about to be hit by something even more devastating. And this is kind of the idea. Whenever people who are ungodly and living in ungodliness and kind of participating in things of the world see a judgment against the bigger wicked person, and they rejoice in that, and they're like, see, they got what was coming to them, but there's no lesson learned and there's no changing from that, then God's point is the same thing is going to happen to you. So I think this is a good reminder to us. It happens with the Philistines. It's going to happen with all these nations that are delivered from judgment. is that they're either going to learn to humble themselves, or God's going to later on bring a judgment against them. So we're out of time for today. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a picture of where we're going. And next week, like I said, buckle up because we're going to cover a lot of ground. I'm not sure how we're going to do that yet, but just read as much of those chapters as you can, 15 through 20, and we'll be prepared to cover the judgments against those nations next week. Thank you, everybody.